Welcome, friends, to Yoga and Podcast. This show brings the magic and highlights the science of yoga, bringing concepts down to earth for the everyday person to help you live your best life. I'm your host, Ashley Weber, a yoga and Pilates teacher and forever student who is oh so curious about all things yoga and. On today's episode, we will explore yoga and the breath with the wise Leslie Kaminoff. Leslie has over 40 years expertise in teaching yoga within the community, specializing in breath and anatomy. He is the author of the wildly successful book, Yoga Anatomy, which virtually every yoga teacher or yoga enthusiast I know has this book. We discuss how the book came about. It's actually pretty unusual. And Leslie gives advice to emerging yoga teachers. We also learn about his nonprofit, The Breathing Project. I am so excited to share with you this conversation. Let's sit back, relax, and enjoy the episode, y'all. Joining us on today's episode, he is the author of a million-selling yoga book, Yoga Anatomy. Every yoga teacher I know has this book. Founder of the nonprofit, The Breathing Project. He is an internationally recognized specialist in the field of yoga and breath anatomy with over 40 years of expertise. Please welcome to the show, Leslie Kaminoff. Leslie, how are you today?
I'm doing well. I'm actually kind of excited to be in the midst of a fall travel teaching season, which has not happened for the past couple of years. I just recently got back from teaching in London, and before that I was in Los Angeles, and I'm on my way back to California next month for an annual visit to my friends at Soul of Yoga to teach in their yoga therapy program. So it feels a little bit like life as I used to know it.
Oh, that's nice. Some sense of going back to normal in a way. I feel like everyone knows who you are, but the one person listening who's living under a rock, do you care to share even more about who you are in the world of yoga?
Who am I in the world of yoga? Well, that's kind of an interesting question to someone that's been, teaching since 1979, because the world of yoga was very, very different back then. So in some sense, I feel like I function as a bit of a repository of institutional memory as far as our world is concerned, because I was present at certain inflection points in this world and turning it into kind of what we know it as today. So other than, having been teaching the anatomy component for as long as I have, I think what's more relevant in current terms is, we started putting my yoga anatomy online courses on the web like over 12 years ago. So we sort of led the way with some of that, which meant the transition to everything going online the last few years was not as big a deal for me as maybe for some other folks. So I think, when I saw you going to ask that question, the answer like gadfly came up, because I have been a bit of a gadfly on certain hot topic issues over the years, not the least of which was the immediate aftermath of us sitting down and figuring out these 200 and 500 hour standards. And I was one of the early critics of the Yoga Alliance when it was first considering coming into being. Because I had previously served as vice president of Unity in Yoga, which was a group that organized yoga conferences and which actually turned into the Alliance. So I've sort of been in these kinds of bigger conversations for a while, and I'd like to think that I've had some kind of positive influence.
Oh my God, yes, of course.
Well, I mean, in these conversations, in for example, the idea that we should keep the government out of our business in terms of regulating yoga and things like that. So, yeah.
You've been doing this a really long time. How did it come about in your life? How did you find yoga initially? Like, how did that happen?
Well, I was 20 years old and living on my own in New York City here. Um, and my father, who was going through kind of a midlife crisis, was getting into a lot of things like running marathons and doing primal scream therapy, and yoga was one of them. And he was taking classes at the Shivananda Yoga Center, which is here on 24th Street.
Mhm.
Should point that way from where I'm sitting. Um, and he invited me to class, and I took it. And like many, many people I've spoken to over the decades, it was my very first Shavasana that got me hooked. And I went back, took a beginner's course. And by the next summer, 1979, I was signed up for a summer of yoga teacher training at their main ashram in Canada. And I kind of haven't looked back since. It's been one long, continuous learning experience since then.
I love that you said the Shavasana is like what hooked you in. That's so
Well,
cool.
I mean, for a 20-year-old to lie down with the specific intention of focusing on his body in that particular way and systematically relaxing it, that was an unprecedented relationship that I was being asked to have with my own sort of internal landscape. And I think it's similar for a lot of people. Is like the first real experience of something like embodiment, and it can be absolutely life-changing, as it was for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing that. So the breath is important, but why is it so important?
Well, obviously, without restating the obvious, is that there's no life without it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think for a couple of reasons that I've identified over the years. Number one, it's a process that's both voluntary and autonomic, meaning we have some choice over what we do with our breath and how we relate to our breath. Um, but ultimately, as much as we learn to control it with some of the practices and techniques that we learn, what we also learn right away, as soon as we start trying to control it, is that there's a vast amount of our breathing activity that's outside of our control, that in fact is controlling us and our behavior. And so this exploring this in a conscious way, this relationship between that which we can control and that which we cannot, to which we must surrender, puts us right at the heart of the conversation, which is yoga practice, because that goes right to Patanjali's definition of yoga practice from the second chapter of the sutras of tapas and swadhyaya and ishvara pranidhana. And tapas is relating to the aspects that you can take some control over and change from their habitual way of being. Ishvara pranidhana is the attitude we must have towards the things that we can't control, that are bigger than us, that control us. And swadhyaya, of course, is the attitude that's required to be able to distinguish one from the other. And that, in fact, is a restatement of another famous formulation, which is the Serenity Prayer, which is
Mm.
a fundamental statement of the human condition. And it's our breathing, because it's both voluntary and autonomic. So it working with the breath puts us in that conversation.
The Serenity Prayer, may I have the wisdom to know the difference?
The strength to change the things I can, the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, and the wisdom to know the difference.
Wisdom to know the difference. Okay.
Yeah, of course.
Wow. Yeah.
Mm.
So how did Yoga Anatomy came about? How did it come about writing the book?
I was actually at the time, and we're talking about 2004, maybe, which was just a year after I started the studio, the Breathing Project. I was already working on a proposal with a friend of mine who is my literary agent, who's also a client and very much into yoga. Um, I was working on a proposal for another book that was really fundamentally about breathing.
Mm-hmm.
James Nestor has already written that book. Don't need to do that anymore. And actually, also Restoring Prana is a fantastic book about breathing from a yogic perspective. This is Robin Rothenberg's book. So there's and Donna Farhi wrote a book about breathing in the meantime. So there's a lot of really, really good writing about a similar perspective I would have brought to that topic. So I was already in the mode of thinking of writing a book, but I was actually approached by the publisher, Human Kinetics, with the idea of this project. They found me just searching the web as someone who taught yoga anatomy.
Yeah.
And so it's really rare for a new, unproven, unpublished author to be approached by a publisher with a proposal to write a book. It's always the other way around.
Yeah.
And so it was their idea. And after trying to convince them that it couldn't be done, because you can't reduce yoga asanas to certain specific muscles and light them up with illustrations like they did with their best-selling book, Strength Training Anatomy. That was what gave them the idea. That's a book they published that sells even better than mine. It's been on the market a lot longer, by Frederick de Lavier, and it's a beautiful book, beautifully illustrated. I already had it on my shelf, so I knew the book when they called me. And I said, look, this isn't like strength training. Asanas are about the whole body, and how do you even analyze them? And for some reason, after trying to convince them it couldn't be done, I wrote a proposal, and they approved it, and then I was really in trouble.
Because then you had to do it. Yeah.
Then I had to do it, but I couldn't do it alone. So that's when I brought in Amy Matthews, who's the co-author of the book, who did the heavy lifting as far as the analysis goes, because she's a certified movement analyst. And, our two brains working together was really what it took to get the book written. And so that's how Amy, who was running the breathing project with me at the time, became the co-author.
And I can't wait to ask you more questions about the breathing project, but I'm curious about, the classroom setting, and you do an inquiry based, or there's more than just inquiry based, but what might be pros and cons of inquiry in a yoga classroom setting?
Well, like anything, it needs to be balanced. Like I just quoted the sutras. Patanjali is really at the heart of most of the things my teacher Desikachara was trying to convey, and there was always a sutra and the teachings around the sutra that was inspiring whatever lesson he was presenting to us. And so, this idea of sthira and sukha that we get as a definition of yoga asana goes beyond asana. It goes to every successful living organism, and what it takes to find balance or homeostasis in a living organism. Like when you look at the cell, the membrane of the cell has to be permeable. Stuff has to be able to get in and out, but it also has to not let the good stuff out or the bad stuff in, right? So it's selectively permeable, and that's the boundary aspect of what a cell does. And so we see that how just by looking at life you can come up with this idea of sthira and sukha, of the stability, which is balanced by the permeability or the space, because ka means space, sukha is good space. And so in a teaching environment, the inquiry to me is the sukha. It's the space that you create for a student to have a feeling of validation for whatever their experience is. As long as it's theirs, as long as it comes from their own contemplative swadhyaya, we could say, focus, there's no wrong answer to an inquiry. No, there's no possible wrong answer to an inquiry, even if that answer is, I'm confused. Desikachara would often say that the recognition of confusion is itself a form of clarity. So if that's the result of an inquiry, you're not wrong, you're right. You recognize your state. And how can that get in balance? When there's not enough structure, when there's not enough sthira. And the sthira in a teaching environment is the technique you're trying to teach, that you're trying to convey. I'm sure we've all been in classes where it's been imbalanced in either direction. If it's imbalanced in the direction of the sukha of, oh, it's okay, there's no focus on technique or alignment, just do what feels good. Just I'll play some music, roll around on the floor and see what you feel. It's like, that can provoke anxiety. People who really do need some kind of structure to hang on to. It's like, what is it we're actually learning here, right?
Yeah.
And so, of course, on the other direction, if you're learning technique with no inquiry being encouraged, then you're just in a dogmatic situation where it's like, this is how you do it. This is how it's, correct. This is how it's incorrect. And if you do it correctly, you'll get the result. And if you're not getting the results, because there's something wrong with you. See, because unlike inquiry, techniques have a right and wrong answer. You
Mm.
you're not doing it, or you can be doing it partially or part way, or learning an aspect of the technique that you'll eventually be able to assemble into that skill. So that's what gives structure. That's the sthira. So like everything else in life, there has to be a balance between the sthira and the sukha in a learning environment.
Well, how do we do that? How do we balance it? How do you balance it, Leslie?
Well, here's the thing: most of the workshops I teach are attended by primarily other yoga teachers. So whenever I'm teaching a technique, I'm not just teaching the thing about breathing or movement or the spine or whatever. I'm teaching about how I'm teaching it. So there's like a meta level.
Mm.
Okay, here's how we're going to go through this experience of gradually building up from more of an inquiry based approach, where you're just seeing where you land right now in this moment with this simple thing we're doing. And as we make this thing more complex and it gets more techniquey, so to speak, note the words that I'm using and what I'm saying and what I'm not saying, and what your experience is as we go through this, and it gets closer to the actual technique I'm trying to teach. So I think for us educators, it really is more than anything about being aware, just like in an asana, being aware of the qualities of sthira and sukha. That's we use our own bodies as laboratories for learning these principles. So, how do you teach it? You have to experience it in your own body, in your own practice, through this lens, perhaps, of this sthira and sukha. And then when you're teaching from that experience, you will find a way in your own words how to convey it, which is different than just taking a workshop with me and then regurgitating things you heard me say, the next day when you go to teach. That happens a lot. You can't stop that from happening. But there's a difference between sharing a meal by learning how to cook the recipe and then cook the meal for someone else, and just eating a meal going, oh, that's delicious, I want to share it. Here, you vomit it and feed it to someone else. But we would never think of doing that with food, but we do it with information.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is, well, first of all, you're teaching teachers, so you are teaching yoga, but it's like another level of you're teaching how to teach yoga, or you're teaching how to teach the structure of whatever it is that you're teaching that day. And
Yeah.
then my question is about inquiry. Is inquiry just curiosity? Like, is inquiry just like asking a bunch of questions, or
Well, I mean,
like,
curiosity is what gets you to do the work of inquiry. If you don't have the curiosity, then really you just want someone to tell you what to do and what you should be feeling.
okay.
And you don't want to take you don't want to accept the kind of agency that a teacher like me wants to give you. And I always say that when we're talking about safe learning environments, and trauma sensitive and all of that stuff that is current conversation these days. It is about giving people options. It's about giving them choices. It's about creating a safe environment, with the understanding that many people, for whatever reason, can only accept so much agency at any one time, which is why the structure is very important for them.
I see.
So it's going to be different for every person in the room. And that's the art. That's the art of teaching. And also keep in mind, the people in my room are not just teachers, but quite frequently there's teachers who teach teachers how to teach. So the stakes are higher as you go up that chain, like exponentially higher. Because I always want people to come away with at least one or two aha moments, like significant inflection points in their understanding of what it is we practice and how we teach what we practice. But you don't get to the ahas unless you've had several uh-ohs. Of course, because the uh-oh is where the stuff you thought you knew sort of starts flying apart, and you can't hold it together anymore because you've learned something new that makes you not want to say this thing you've been saying to your students. like when I teach about breathing, there's a lot of myths about breathing. There's a lot of myths about anatomy. There's a lot of myths about yoga. And when you look at the actual structural, anatomical, physiological basis of how the body operates, some of those myths get shattered, and those shattered pieces, the ohs, are what you're going to build your ahas out of. And for someone who's just a practitioner, the ohs are pretty small because you're just in it for yourself. That it's not there's nothing at stake other than your own understanding, your own practice. If you're a teacher, it's not just for yourself, it's all the stuff that's been coming out of your mouth that you've been teaching your students, and that's a bigger If you're a teacher who teaches teachers, exponentially the ohs are they're turning into, oh shit, like I've been, like, think of the numbers of people that are affected by this stuff I've been teaching, which I don't think I want to say anymore. And then if you like consider the position I'm in, who has his name on this friggin' book that people use, who teach people how to teach, and you're going through it, after 10 years, like Amy and I last year were working on this third edition, and we're reading the words that are in print in like a million books that we would never say that way anymore. The way we were saying it 10 years ago. We're like, oh no. It's like, I don't want to curse so much on your podcast, but that's how it felt. The stakes are exponentially higher.
We all have a voice and something important to share with the world. Now it's easier, more than ever, to make a podcast of your very own and to amplify your voice thanks to Anchor by Spotify. I have been using this platform for going on 3 years now, and I can confidently say it is the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need right at your fingertips. Here's how it works. Anchor lets you record and edit podcasts right from your phone or computer, so no matter what your setup is like, you can start creating right now, as in like today. With a single push of a button, you can distribute your podcast to the most popular listening platforms, including Spotify. Anchor is also the only place you can publish video podcasts to Spotify. With Anchor, creators can earn money in a variety of ways, including ads and podcast subscriptions. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Yes, you heard it correctly. Anchor is free. Download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. I cannot wait to hear your podcast. Hey friends! I just discovered my new favorite yoga accessory, Yoga Knees. This product really saved my knees. Yoga Knees help solve the problem of those times in class when we kneel on hard surfaces like your yoga mat. Now your knees can also be pain-free with Yoga Knees. They are super comfortable and made with durable material. Yoga Knees is a high-quality, built-to-last product. They are a woman-owned business manufactured by women and made in the USA. When you buy a pair of Yoga Knees, $1 of the proceeds goes towards St. Jude's Children's Research Hospital. Yoga Knees is giving you all 10% off your first order. Go to yogaknees.com, that's spelled YOGAKNEES.com, and use promo code YOGAAND at checkout. The link is in the show notes. 30-day money-back guarantee. Remember to use promo code YOGAAND to get 10% off. And we're back.
Well, that's a really great point you bring up. I don't really think about breath myths, yoga myths. Like, what would be an example of a myth that you're saying?
Well, that deeper, longer breathing is always better, right? That belly breathing is good, yogic, diaphragmatic, healthy breathing, and breathing that happens here is unhealthy, it's undiaphragmatic, and we should avoid it. That's a very damaging myth about breathing that I spend a considerable amount of time debunking in many of my workshops.
Damaging? Damaging in what way?
Because it shuts people. Look, your lungs are in your chest. Your rib cage should move.
Yeah.
Right? How it's moving and what's making it move yeah, you can do that in efficient and inefficient ways. Let's talk about that. But to tell people that only the belly movement is diaphragmatic, and when something happens here, it's not diaphragmatic, that's wrong. The diaphragm happens to move your rib cage
Yeah.
along with your abdominal cavity. So there's things like that. There's this myth that if you just do the alignment properly, the way you've been taught to cue it, that you will be keeping your body safe and you will make your joints safe. When in fact, many of the traditional cues that have been used are actually systematically destroying people's hip joints and knee joints and endangering their
Yeah.
backs. The idea you should always maintain axial extension,
Uh,
what they call neutral extension, even as you're going through these different movements, is damaging. You know,
yeah. It's
uh,
dogmatic, right? I mean, it just
yeah,
sounds like these rules you're mentioning are like pretty dogmatic. Like
it's
every
pragmatic
people
and
have
it's
different bodies.
intrinsic. The other thing, it's intrinsic, meaning
Mm.
that you think that that asanas have some intrinsic property to them that can be applied universally to people. Like this is, and it's the same with contraindications. Oh, that's a dangerous asana. This is a healthy asana. If you do this, you'll get this and this effect. There are no asanas without people. They don't
Mm.
exist. They don't exist without someone putting their body in a shape. And that person is unique, and they have a unique constitution and experience and history, and they will have a unique reaction with this shape that you're asking them to do. And unless you can put them into their own experience, an inquiry-based experience, you're not going to know what's going on. You're just going to impose your preconceived ideas of what should be happening on their experience. And they're either going to get it wrong and think there's something wrong with them, or convince themselves that they're getting it right, or in either case they're not going to be having their own authentic inquiry-based experience of what's going on. They're always going to be reliant on some external factor to
Mm.
determine where they're at in this practice.
Yeah, I see what you, I mean, I totally get what you mean by that. Going back to the breath, I
Mhm.
listened to a podcast you were on somewhat recently, and you
Mhm.
shared on the show that you had COVID, and
Mhm.
I'm so curious, like what
I
that
had it
was like.
twice, not just
Twice.
yes.
I didn't know it was twice.
Well, I had the Omicron I got that was my Christmas gift last year.
Oh,
Was yeah. Yeah.
well, what was, I mean, you are a body person. Like how was that like for you working
It
with
sucked. It
breath?
sucked big time. Well, it sucked less for me than for
Mhm,
someone who would have had exactly, I'd say, the same level of symptoms,
mhm, mhm,
who didn't have all the breath training and understanding of all
mhm,
the years. Because I had experience in connecting with and recalibrating my breathing rhythm and
mhm,
volume and all of that. Um, if the normal range of my breathing pre-COVID was here, like with very shallow on one end and very deep on the other, and I could easily go from one to the other depending on whatever situation I was in.
mhm,
Okay. With COVID, it was here.
mm.
If I went too deep with my breath, I would have uncontrollable fits of coughing. And if I went too shallow, I would immediately get a feeling of suffocating panic.
Oh gosh.
Right. And that's where people were having really bad reactions to their symptoms. I don't think it was the symptoms that killed people. It was their reactions to the symptoms, which sent them into some breath crisis, some kind of severe hyperventilative stress or uncontrollable coughing or whatever. And they get rushed to the ER and they put on ventilators, and then they were goners, a lot
Uh-huh.
of. So it was a very interesting experience in having to moment recalibrate my breathing and to not panic, to relax into a shallow breath. Many people don't know how to relax into a shallow breath, to let a shallow breath be enough. Is if you're relaxed and not tensing up and not panicking and are still, shallow breathing can be providing you with enough oxygen to get by, okay, without triggering the panic of suffocation.
Mhm.
Now, many people I've worked with over the years, thousands of people with, I guess, a body work practice as well. You can see the table that's behind me. That's my bodywork table. That for people who have breathing disorders, that's sort of the main order of business at one point, is to say, okay, you're lying on a table, you're going to relax here. You don't need to be breathing deeply. Let's see if you can do diaphragmatic breathing for sure, but quiet, relaxed, efficient, small breaths, and be okay with that. Because if you get into some crisis at some point and all you can get are shallow breaths, you need to be able to relax into that and not keep trying to breathe deeply, because that's what's going to deepen your crisis.
I see.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, that is good information to know, because I wouldn't have thought relax into the shallow breath. That is,
you have to. You have no other choice.
Wow.
And it's not just COVID, it's a host of other things. And you see, like Robin, for example, Robin Rothenberg, who actually very kindly offered to work with me with some of the stuff she does when she heard I had COVID. And I found it very, very helpful to have her perspective as well. She'd probably call it, building up your tolerance for CO2 in your system. Building up your ability to hold into those long pauses at the end of an exhale in a relaxed way without panicking, so that your whole neurological breathing circuit is being conditioned to not just trigger immediately as soon as your CO2 gets to a certain level in your blood. You want it to tolerate a much higher level before you let the next breath get triggered. And that's the key really mechanism behind something like the Buteyko method, which has been used for years to treat people with asthma and other breathing problems. So, and we call it Bhayakumbhaka in yoga, working with the external retention. So all of that came into play that helped me get through my sort of COVID crisis. I was an early adopter. I got it in March of 2020 in Sydney, Australia, actually, at a teaching event I was doing there, where we had 70 people in a room, no masks, no precautions, no distancing. No one thought that COVID was in Australia at that point.
Oh,
and
man.
It was, because that's exactly the same time and place where Tom Hanks got it. I think that's what got people's attention. It was like, oh, if Tom Hanks get it, can get it, anyone can get it.
Yeah.
So
And you're back. You're back. You're doing minute alms, and you're back.
Oh, you saw that? Yeah, I posted a video of me doing a minute long. Well, to be fair, it was like 58.5 seconds or something. But anyway, yeah. Well, first of all, I'm 64 now. I was 62 when I got COVID, so I'm older. And there will always be lingering effects of the long COVID, as far as I can tell so far. But I've learned to deal with them, and it's just part of learning that I just need a lot more maintenance than I used to, and I need to be kinder to myself and not assume that I'm just some kind of Superman who can deal with anything because of my yoga or whatever.
Okay, so we are living in, post-pandemic times. Where do you see the future of yoga?
Oh, well, that's a pretty broad question. It's going to be, as it has been, a little bit of everything that's adapting to its times and the needs of people. It's going to have stuff that is not exactly my cup of tea, but that's always been the case.
Yeah.
I think we'll have more permutations, like doga or goat yoga or
beer yoga
or 420 yoga, all that, and I've always been a strong advocate for keeping the free market of ideas free, and no one assuming the job of saying that someone else can't do this or that with the word yoga attached to it because it's defaming yoga or whatever. It's really, it's about giving people an entry point into an experience, because you can have your life-shattering shavasana in a beer yoga class, or maybe with a goat crawling on you, or maybe in a hot naked whatever power vinyasa thing that you've just, whatever permutation it is, if it gets you in the door and it gets you into a situation where somebody is going to ask you to have this experience of embodiment, of bringing your mind and your body and your breath together in a way that you perhaps never have done before, I think it's fine. I think it's desirable, because look, I'm always going to be necessarily feeding my family on a very small slice of the overall yoga pie. As a percentage of the overall yoga pie, my slice, the percentage that I get to eat is really, really small compared to all of it. So I would be a fool for arguing that that pie should be smaller. I want that pie to be bigger. So my little slice is more nourishing, right? So just I have perfectly selfish reasons for wanting as many permutations of yoga going on out there as possible. And now with the pandemic and the idea that breathing is important, there's a slight chance that my slice of pie may actually grow a little bit as a percentage of the overall pie, because I've been out here talking about breathing for the past 40 some odd years. So, you know, and, you know, to be real about it, a lot of the brick and mortar operations that would have invited someone like me to come in and teach are gone, you know, and the ones that are remaining are struggling to find models that actually work to sustain them. And the online component is always going to be with us, and it should be, because it gives access to people that would otherwise not have access. It gives agency to people who can just hit the red button. If they don't like what's going on, they can turn off their camera, right? You know, if I don't like what's happening in this interview, look what I can do, right? I can see you, but you can't see me, right? So, you know, and so this is good. And so and you know, a lot of us who teach now have an ever increasing archive of us teaching with Zoom recordings and things like that. So we build our own platforms in ways that we never have before online. And that's exactly what I'm doing right now. I've got, you know, hours and hours of me teaching that are accessible to people now that wouldn't have been able to get their bodies to the room where I was teaching. But we have it now, either recordings we make live, you know, in the room, or the Zoom recordings. And we're working to make that accessible to people.
Well, let's talk about your breathing project, the Breathing Project. Tell us more about it.
Well, the Breathing Project, first and foremost, was always an educational nonprofit, a 501c3 that I founded in 2002. And for many years, it was a studio that ran under that name here in New York between 2003 and 2017. Okay, so for 14 years, we ran that studio, and Amy was the managing director, Amy Matthews. And now it is basically being turned into this online platform at breathingproject.com, where we're gathering information and writing and video and community, really, under the breathingproject.com banner. And it's really the umbrella that we use whenever I go out and teach, because it has a mission and it has a certain community that gathers around it. But it's not actually a physical studio at the moment. It's more of a virtual space and an actual physical space that kind of comes with me wherever I'm invited to teach.
Cool. So is there a particular person that the Breathing Project is for, or is it for everybody?
It's for everybody who breathes. That's
yeah.
Answer. You know, that was a softball pitch. That was a T-ball. It wasn't even a pitch.
I teed it up.
Yeah, you teed it up. So yeah, but more specifically, we do, when we had the studio, and as I mentioned, now when I teach, a lot of what we do is for other educators. And that's what we figured out at the Breathing Project pretty quickly. We're not a yoga studio where people are going to come and pay us and buy class cards and whatever. We tried that. It really wasn't, you know, our thing. What it turned into was like a postgraduate place where people who had already graduated some teacher training program could come and learn some of the specific things we were teaching about: anatomy, kinesiology, eventually infant developmental movement, which is Amy's specialty.
Oh, cool.
Because in the space where the studio used to be, Amy's Babies Project is still there.
Cool.
So, you know, all these things were sort of aimed at other educators. And so we didn't have to compete with our own training program with all of our friends who were running the training programs at the studios in New York. We didn't want to compete with them. We wanted to support their graduates. And so that's sort of one of our main missions, is to support in kind of a postgraduate way people that want to further their understanding of things that we do. Also, we run cadaver dissection workshops. That's one of the ways we teach anatomy.
I love
So
that.
we get a lot of yoga teachers who come to that, and other people who want to learn anatomy in that environment by doing actual human cadaver dissection.
Yeah, and really seeing it all. That's so cool.
Seeing it and smelling it. Yeah.
Smelling it. Well, I don't know how cool smelling it is, but yeah.
No way around that one.
Yeah. That's so like what a rich learning environment you're creating with the Breathing Project. And I have to ask you this before we finish up. New yoga teachers. So it sounds like yoga teachers, this is like the Breathing Project is just such a great continuing education for them. But I know this is a broad question, but in general, what advice do you give new yoga teachers?
It's funny you should mention that, because that's one of the books that I'm talking with my literary agent now about possibly working on.
Oh, cool.
You know how those books like Letters to a Young Chef and all of that? There's a whole series that Hachette does, the publishers of Letters to a Young whatever. And the idea of like letters to a young yoga teacher is something that appeals to me. So I have been giving thought to this. And what I would say is a young yoga teacher, well, young in, not necessarily years, but young in this sort of business of teaching, right? I think the first thing to understand is that we don't start off as teachers when we graduate from a teacher training program, or even if we didn't graduate, when we first begin working with people. What I would call that phase is instructor, just like I was when I graduated the Shivananda teacher's training course in 1979. I wasn't a teacher. That's what they called me. But I was really an instructor, because I was taught to teach a class. I was taught to teach what I had been taught to teach. There was a script, there was a sequence, and there was a support structure for me to learn how to be a teacher from being an instructor. So to take that pressure off of somebody when they're first starting out and say, look, don't expect to have the answers. Don't expect to have an authentic voice at first. There are exceptions. Some people come into this field having been accomplished educators in other fields, and they already know what good pedagogy is. They already know how to put a learning experience together for people. But for the most part, we evolve from instructors to teachers over time by paying attention to what's going on, how people are responding to the words that come out of our mouth, and how to sort of tailor those words to get through in a better way to people. And that's exactly how I learned. And what sent that into like hyperdrive for me was when I really started paying attention to how people were breathing in response to what I was asking them to do. And that was Jessica Char's influence. At the time, I didn't know it explicitly, but it was. Because just hearing that there was a guy who thought it was all in the breath back in 1981, I think. And I didn't meet the man until 1988. But it stuck in my mind that there was some teacher out there who thought that it was all in the breathing. And it got me to focus on that. And you'll, as I said at the outset, once you're in that conversation of breath, you're beginning to notice right away the things that you can change, the things that won't change, and how to tell the difference. And our bodies tell us that too. In your very first yoga class, there's things that are easy for your body to do. There are things that are hard for your body to do. There's things that were hard that will become easy. There's things that were easy, which as you age will become hard. And some things which were hard in the beginning will never change because they're impossible for your body. And that's the nature of your body, and you have to surrender to that. So all of these lessons are available if we know how to pay attention in a certain way.
And I love what you're saying about, like, I think we have so much, there's implied pressure when you graduate and you get the certificate that you should just have it all figured out as a teacher. And you're saying there shouldn't be all
That's
the
the message you
pressure.
got from your training. That's a shitty training. I'll tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an evolution. It's not
Yeah.
like you're
Yeah.
gonna just overnight become this authentic teacher that,
Nobody,
yeah.
nobody does. Nobody does. And some people never do. Some people remain instructors, which is fine. The world needs instructors.
Mhm.
You know, the world needed instructors back in the early 90s when the demand for yoga teachers far outstripped the supply because the gyms all wanted this yoga that was this hot, sweaty kind of vinyasa thing that was getting popular,
Uh-huh.
and they just wanted it, and there weren't enough teachers. So, someone had the brilliant business idea of like, look, you've already got instructors who know how to do aerobics. Give them to me for a weekend and I'll teach them how to teach a yoga class. You can put it on the schedule next week.
Oh God.
They're already on the payroll. Well, how do you think Yoga Fit got born?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah.
Right? And I'm not putting it down. She had this amazing insight about how to very rapidly increase the supply of yoga teachers, but they were instructors. The world needs instructors. They were
Uh-huh.
taught to teach a class. And that was just that the market, the free market meeting a demand that was there with supply.
Mhm.
That's all it was. But that's what got us sitting down in those rooms to figure out how many hours we thought it might take to train a teacher, because we were damn sure a weekend wasn't enough.
Yeah.
So that provoked the response of, hey, maybe we should have some industry-wide minimum standards, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, thank God for you, Leslie. I'm so glad I
Thank God
got
for the
to
atheists like Leslie.
what, atheist?
That's a whole other podcast, dude. Yeah, you forgot to ask me about that.
Yeah, I guess the expression "thank God," and if you're an atheist, that doesn't fit.
No. My teaching tradition has a history of that, because Krishnamacharya, in one of his rare moments of humor, from what I could gather, said, "Thank God I have passed my exams in Sankhya," which, if we understand Sankhya as a godless philosophy, which is considered atheistic by Vedanta, he was being funny when he said, "Thank God." He was a religious guy. So he said, "Thank God I passed my exams in Sankhya." So yeah, everyone uses it at some point or
I
other.
love it. I love it. Well, where can we find you in the world of yoga, and what do you have coming up for the future? And I hope you write that book about letters to young yoga teachers.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm still working that out. I would need time to do it. People can find me at yogaanatomy.org. That's my personal website, and there's links to everything else there, including breathingproject.com, which is this online community that we're building. We're about to embark on a big marketing push for breathingproject.com. So you'll probably see something about it out there as we build our list and put it out there. Marketing is something that is not a skill set of mine. So thank goodness there's people out there who actually know how to do it, who know how to work in the yoga world. So there's that. I'll be doing more traveling. We're working on a European tour for next fall. Looks like it'll include Amsterdam and Glasgow, where I hopefully will be co-teaching with my friend Gary Carter, who is a wonderful teacher of yoga and anatomy and movement. Possibly another trip to London we're talking about. I'll be in California again next year. So yeah, the touring thing is kind of coming back together, but all of that you can find at yogaanatomy.org, where my calendar is. And you can also find my email there. If people want to reach out personally, I'm always open to corresponding with folks and getting back to them about anything they want to correspond about.
You also have a podcast, Leslie.
I do. How did you know about that? Yes, it's a brand new podcast, and I put up a new one at this point every 3 weeks to a month, and they'll be closer together once I get more content. But it's called Clinical Corner, and it's where I do an interview with somebody who, like me, specializes in working one-on-one with other people, and we talk about their history and the methods they use, and And then the second hour, it's a 2 hour, it's long. In the second hour, which is the premium content that people have to sign up for at breathingproject.com, we actually review a video of them working with a private client and talk about the choices they've made. We get to be a fly on the wall and inside the head of the yoga therapist or practitioner as they're working with somebody. And this is something that's never been done before, because these are always private situations, but we can learn an enormous amount about the work we do from these kinds of conversations. So I'm kind of excited about that Clinical Corner, and it's on all the platforms, Apple and whatnot. So you can find it there.
Great. Well, I've listened to a few episodes actually, and I am a subscriber. So I'm excited that it's new and you're going to keep putting more and more episodes out.
Great. Yeah. Well, check it out. Yeah, the first hour is always free. You don't have to pay for that. And then it's the second hour that people can see if they want to sign up.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really enjoyed talking to you today, Leslie.
It was a pleasure. Great questions and great conversation.
Okay. Thank you. Bye.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode, all about yoga and the breath, with the knowledgeable Leslie Kaminoff. Be sure to connect with Leslie. All of his info is linked in the show notes, so you're just one click away from connecting with him, and I highly recommend that you do. I have one favor to ask. Can you please text this episode to a friend who you know will love the show? I thank you so much in advance for the favor. Word of mouth really helps support Yoga and Podcast in reaching a greater audience, and we cannot grow without you. So thank you, thank you, thank you. If you want to drop us a line, our email is yogaandpodcast@gmail.com. The and is spelled out YOGAAND podcast@gmail. You can follow us on Instagram. We are now on TikTok and even Twitter. And we have the same handle for all three. It's Yoga and Podcast. And when you follow us on those platforms, we will follow you right back. The theme song is performed by Ali Holder. Graphics, guest booking, and media by Bentley and Chloe Productions. Thank you for listening.